The Collapse video series is for entertainment purposes only. Do not commit acts of violence. Winter is almost over. Days are getting longer and milder. The snow is melting. Trees are showing small buds that will later turn into leaves. A sense of relief and optimism spreads as the threat of freezing to death subsides. But that relief and optimism are soon dampened. It is time to begin growing seedlings indoors and in greenhouses. Those who know how to do that teach those who don't. The problem is that there is a seed shortage. In farm country, a large portion of the crops, over 90% of corn and soy, are genetically modified organisms or GMOs. The seeds are created in a lab and purchased in bulk by farmers annually. The labs are now closed. The farmers used all of their lab seeds in the previous year. Some farmers and gardeners have what's known as heirloom seeds, which are natural seeds, but there aren't enough. Similarly, too many chickens and cows were eaten for their meat when they should have been saved for eggs and milk. Over a year, a chicken will produce 16,000 calories worth of eggs, but on a given day, a chicken will only produce 80 calories worth of eggs. Its meat is 1,000 calories. There are perennial foods that don't need to be replanted each year, such as fruit trees, but there aren't enough to supply all the calories and nutrition needed. Everyone will produce what they can, but there will be even less food this year than last year. Preppers are now out of food just like everyone else. While the towns had originally told the preppers that they could keep their stockpiles as long as they shared their skills, that promise did not make it through the winter. Hunger became so great that towns eventually voted to seize prepper supplies. Many preppers who were not part of towns and who were off on their own were eventually discovered by marauders and killed. A few preppers escaped detection, but not many. For the preppers in the towns, their stockpiles may be gone, but their skills are not, and they survived the winter. Preppers off on their own are less likely to be discovered, but more likely to be slaughtered when they are discovered. That's the trade-off. Rural towns pick up their organization efforts that had been temporarily set aside in the winter. The organizing and networking was critical to fending off gangs of marauders in the summer and fall. It needs to be continued for trade in goods. Some towns have people with pharmaceutical skills, some with blacksmithing skills, some with yarn spinning skills. Where there is a person with skills, the other townspeople scavenge the tools and materials needed to make the most of it and line up to study under the person. Village markets appear. Trade between towns flourishes. The liaison activities for economic reasons reinforce liaison activities for regional security. There are rumors in rural areas that the government still exists, but has changed, and not for the better. A resistance movement might be something to consider. In the Xinjiang province of China, the Chinese government changes its tactics from having the military pursue the Uyghurs directly to instead having the Han paramilitaries do it, providing them with weapons, equipment, supplies, and advice while withdrawing most of the military personnel from the area. News of the Uyghur insurgency inspires separatists in the neighboring province of Tibet, where ethnic Han are a mere 8% of the population, while ethnic Tibetans are over 90%. Tibetan separatists see the military withdrawal in Xinjiang as weakness. They determine that this is an opportunity that must be seized. They commence guerrilla tactics against government offices. The central government of China now has multiple rebellions on its hands. But not everything is going poorly for the Chinese Communist Party. The blockade against Taiwan has worked. The island nation is out of food and fuel. People are starving. The leaders of the government negotiate a peaceful surrender in exchange for amnesty. In China, India, Indonesia, and Africa, there is a mass exodus of the wealthier members of society. Refugees are arriving by the thousands in Australia, New Zealand, and Brazil, with no way to force them back to their home countries. At first, there was a strong contingency advocating for the refugees to be welcomed, taken care of, and provided with a new permanent home. The advocacy grew out of compassion for children who were clearly starving and had been through so much. However, as thousands of refugees turned into tens of thousands and tens of thousands turned into hundreds of thousands, with no sign of slowing down, local communities became overwhelmed. It finally dawns on most of the generous citizens of Australia, New Zealand, and Brazil that they simply cannot feed and house potentially a few billion refugees. If it continues, it is their own children who will be starving. There is reluctant general agreement that the refugees must be turned away. The news media shows ships of families being forcibly turned back. The citizens watch this on the news and then turn it off. The difficult decision has been made. There is no choice. They don't want to watch. The news media has a sharp drop in ratings when they show the plight of refugees. They eventually stop covering the story. Lack of public attention gives the government greater latitude in its methods of enforcing the no refugee policy. Ships of refugees that refuse to turn around are fired upon. Some of them sink. It does not deter the refugee ships that are determined to make it ashore or die trying. There is nothing to return to. Many more are sunk. Russia invades the Baltic States, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The citizens of those countries were expecting this. They have decided to surrender and engage in asymmetric warfare. Local militias were already organized in advance, have acquired their explosives and other weapons, and have put those items in hidden locations. They knew they could never defeat an invading Russian army. Their strategy is to make conquest untenable in the long run, even if it is initially easy. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, attempts at creating an insurgency have been thwarted. The Russians conquered the nation just a few months ago. Ukrainians had thought they would be able to beat back the Russians as they have in the past. They underestimated how much the international community had pressured Russia to hold back in its previous conflicts with Ukraine. Unlike the Baltic states, Ukraine did not have an insurgency organized and in place. The Ukrainians are finding that building an insurgency from scratch under the watchful eyes of their conquerors is extremely difficult. In Europe, inflation is taking hold. The Protector has pumped so much money into the economy that there is more cash than resources, meaning there is more demand at the price point than there is supply. After the global markets crashed, the Protector hired people from the private sector to work for the government. This kept consumer purchasing high, but as the government doesn't actually produce anything, less is now being produced. The goods the Protector initially acquired after the crash have been used. This is eroding people's life savings. When prices double, one's life savings are worth half as much. Officials in national and local governments announced that the Protector must change his monetary policy and stop printing money. The Protector responds by declaring that the local governments have not given him enough authority to manage the problem. He brings forth hand-picked economists to argue in his favor. He quietly orders the media safety officers to run stories favoring him and disfavoring the opposition. He runs smear campaigns against national and local government officials. The result is that the media and social media overwhelmingly proclaim that the national and local governments are causing the high inflation levels that the Protector is trying to fix. The Protector accuses his detractors of making the emergency worse. He announces that for the good of Europe, he will cease to recognize laws or court orders that impair his ability to manage the emergency. He ensures that the media stops publishing activities or statements made by legislatures or courts. Their activities are not discussed on social media. The national parliaments and courts of Europe still exist, but they operate in silence. Press conferences are empty. Plague is decimating the island of Madagascar. The governments of nearby Mozambique and Tanzania attempted to institute a quarantine around Madagascar, but they simply did not have enough manpower to stop every boat. Refugees fleeing to the African continent by boat believed they had not been exposed to the plague, but it only takes one exposed person to bring the disease, and that's exactly what happened. Pneumonic plague, the airborne version of bubonic plague, has spread quickly to thousands in Mozambique and Tanzania. The population in the area was already weakened when the sudden end of international aid led to severe food shortages and starvation. Starving people get sick more easily. Plague spreads to Zimbabwe, Malawi, and South Africa. It is well past a tipping point where it has become unstoppable.